Alexander Velde the Elder and his son, Willem the Younger, were the most important and influential marine painters of the 17th century. The fact that they're no longer really a household name belies the fact that they were, in the 17th century, extremely sought after and extremely influential. They were Dutch, and having established a thriving studio business in Amsterdam, they moved to England in the winter of 1672-73, in the wake of what the Dutch called the disaster year of 1672. Amsterdam had come effectively under siege by the English and the French. The economy had collapsed and the art market with it. The Van der Veldes, like many artists, sought new opportunities in England. In fact, King Charles II had issued an open invitation to Dutch citizens to relocate to England in exchange for favourable tax conditions. We don't know whether the Van der Veldes responded specifically to this general invitation, or whether they had a more personal invitation from the king, such was their fame already at the time. Either way, Charles made sure he incentivized the Van der Veldes to stay in England by giving them a royal salary, a kind of retainer of £100 each per year, and a studio space to use in the Queen's House at Greenwich. The Van der Veldes studio at the Queen's House would have been a veritable sea of drawings. It would have been overflowing with paper. Drawings were the most valuable studio asset of the Van der Veldes. It was the lifeblood of their creative process, their studio practice, and the key to their success as artists. So this beautiful painting is a really nice example of how many drawings would have fed into the one painting. There are so many different ships here in this scene, and the Van der Veldes would have dipped into their library of ship portraits and of sketches to piece together a composition like this. We know from archival records that the Van der Veldes studio was on the south side of the Queen's House, facing onto the park. Now, a south-facing studio was quite unusual for an artist studio at the time. The preference was always for a north-facing studio. That's because the light coming from the north was more consistent over the course of the day. And indeed, the reason that we know the Van der Veldes had their studio facing south is because there was an order from the Clerk of Works for the installation of shutters. Now, these presumably helped the Van der Veldes have better control over this more changeable south-facing light. The Queen's House that the Van der Veldes knew was a hub of creativity, a melting pot of the arts and sciences. They shared the building with the Astronomer Royal for a period, who took observations from the house while he was waiting for the observatory up the hill to be built. They also shared the house with a French Huguenot jeweller, for example. When it was completed in the 1630s, the Queen's House was absolutely cutting edge. It would have looked much like the glass and steel skyscrapers that we see across the river now from Greenwich. Such was the contrast of this gleaming white, geometric building in the classical style, the very first such building to be designed in Britain. Such was the contrast of this building to the higgledy-piggledy, ramshackle red brick Tudor palace into which it was inserted. Much like today, Greenwich was a hub of maritime life. This was, of course, hugely important and valuable to the Van der Veldes because it provided an endless number of subjects, an endless amount of inspiration for their compositions. So we don't know what the Van der Veldes brought with them exactly to England, but one thing's for sure, they would have brought with them their archive of drawings. This was their most valuable studio asset. Today, at Royal Museums Greenwich, we're lucky to have almost 1,500 drawings by the Van der Veldes. This is the largest such collection in the world. Very few collections of drawings can tell us quite so much about how a 17th century artist studio functioned.